Good afternoon, everybody. Please come in and take your seats. We would like to start in time also this afternoon, after we had lunch, and also a contact group. And our aim is really to go further on the agenda. And one of the issues we are talking about now is agenda item 3F. So agenda item 3F is about the future availability of halons and alternatives. At the 30th MOB in 2018, the parties adopted a decision 30/7 on the future availability of halons and their alternatives. The parties requested TEEP to continue engaging with the IMO and ICAO to better access future amount of halons to support civil aviation. The TEEP through the HTOC, which is renamed now last year to, and I don't know how to work with the abbreviation. It's the Fire Suppression Technical Options Committee, but when I just do it with the abbreviation, it sounds like STOC. And that sounds a little bit like you're already suppressing a fire. So maybe it was done on purpose to rename it like that. The panel was also requested to identify the relative alternatives, the ways to enhance recovery, specific needs and opportunities for recycling, and they provided us with valuable information since then. They also made a progress report last year, and the main elements have been also incorporated in the quadrennial assessment. A summary of that information is provided in addendum 1 to the note by the Secretariat in document 45/2 at 1. And now I would like to open the floor for interventions on this. Please, are there intervention on this item on halons and alternatives? I see that USA is breaking their ice, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair, and apologies. I think everybody is just getting settled after lunch and trying to bring ourselves back to the topics at hand. We did appreciate the information provided by the FS talk regarding halon, and in particular we note a couple things that we saw from the FS talk that we wanted to draw attention to in particular. First and most importantly for us was the information on the revised scenarios that the FS talk provided with regard to the potential run-out dates for halon 1211 and halon 1301, and in particular halon 1301. We note that over the past several years, the FS talk and its prior H talk have provided the parties with information suggesting a range of years by which recovered, recycled, reusable halon would no longer be available. And in particular, in the scenario that was provided for this meeting, in the progress report and the quadrennial assessment report, the FS talk indicated between 2030 and 2049, we may not see available halon. The concern that we have right now is that there seems to be a lack of alternatives for halon for certain high-value applications, including for civil aviation. And in particular, our concern is if this trend continues, and we heard yesterday from the co-chair of the FS talk, that it takes a long time to come up with alternatives for halon, and that they did not see an alternative, viable alternative coming forward for all applications in the near future. So we remain concerned about this. There's been a number of decisions that have been taken over the past several years by the parties, decisions that aim at making sure halon is recovered from shipbreaking, decisions concerning best practices, and the movement of used halons. So at this point, we are considering whether or not it would be appropriate to perhaps pursue another decision on this topic. We'd like to have conversations throughout this meeting, perhaps in the margins, to further assess whether or not a decision would be appropriate or not. We're also concerned with information we heard yesterday from the co-chairs with regards to the destruction of usable halon. And in particular, we'd like to have conversations as well with parties. We can't recall a decision that specifically looked at that matter, so we do want to think about whether or not that would be appropriate. So we'd like to ask that the co-chair for the OEWG leave this agenda item open so that we can have discussions in the margins through the course of this meeting and determine whether or not we think it would be appropriate to bring a decision forward, or CRP forward. Thank you.
Thank you, and also heard your request for the agenda item to leave it open and have discussions in the margins, but let's also first hear other delegation, and I have Australia on my list. Please, Australia.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. First of all, Australia would like to appreciate the work that the it's a tricky acronym rather than HTOC, that the TEEP has done for us on this. We note that this issue has been before us for quite some time, and we sort of have had numerous decisions taken over the years, but it's been parked a little bit for the last few years. And I think it's quite timely that we consider it again, given the amount of evidence and the amount of concerns that have been brought before the parties. A few of the takeaways that we've taken from the report. First of all, looking at the discrepancies between modelled and actual atmospheric concentrations of the three main halons, but of course particularly halon 1301, and the concentrations do not appear to be reducing as was originally anticipated. Also concerns about additional and unaccounted for sources of emissions of halon 1301, such as from feedstock or servicing uses. As the US mentioned, concerns about the long-term availability of halons from banks for enduring uses, and what we're seeing, including in Australia, is limitations on the transboundary movement of halon for essential uses. Also noting that the phase down of HFCs under the Kigali Amendment is already having an effect on the production of high global warming potential HFCs used for fire suppression purposes, and the intention of the manufacturers, or at least one manufacturer, to cease production of these HFCs. The classification of some halon and HFCs alternatives in the fire protection sector as PFAS may also have an impact on the work we are doing here. And of course the ongoing work of skilling up and maintaining skills with the awareness of new Montreal Protocol officers about the valuable role of reclaimed halons. We've seen some of these concerns play out as we work with other countries in the Asia-Pacific region to ensure that small amounts of halon can be imported into countries should it be required in case of a discharge on board an aircraft en route to one of these countries. We've encountered difficulties with stricter than necessary restrictions in some countries, which is making the process of putting in place a system for the potentially urgent transport of halon extremely hard. We'd certainly appreciate the opportunity to work with other countries and talk through this issue a little bit more, whether it be formally or informally. I would note the suggestion from the United States, so we would be very happy to work with the US and other countries and see where we may take this issue, but we do believe that there are now some very important halon-related issues that we need to consider and develop potential ways forward. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, Australia, and also you have the same request as the US did. And now I understand it's better to talk about FS talk, so yeah, that sounds logical to me as well. European Union.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. So we would also like to thank the FSTOC for this work, and we would agree with previous speakers that this is an important topic given the relevance of halons for applications such as in civil aviation. What we wouldn't want in any near or far future is that we would have to produce new halons again for that purpose. For our domestic use, we have our recent update of legislation. We have looked into the availability on the EU market, relevant parameters such as the reclaim, emissions, imports, export, etc. And we do seem to have a stable situation of supply on the EU market. So at least we seem to be, for the immediate future, not seeing major difficulties, but we do hear the message that TEEP is giving us that we may be facing a situation of shortage in the future at the global level. As for our domestic regulation, we will be prohibiting the destruction of halons as an additional way of ensuring that all halon that can be recovered and reclaimed will be recovered and reclaimed, and to ensure that we have enough for the future. So given that now the TEEP has told us that we may face an issue, we would be very happy to talk to others on this issue on the margin. So as others, again, happy to engage and see what we can do to ensure that the supply is guaranteed for where it's needed.
Okay, good to hear also the interest to engage in the margins. And Canada?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. And we would, as others have done, we would like to first thank the FS talk for their work and on the very useful information provided in the report and as provided as part of Decision 37. The information provides insight on the current availability of Halon, but also highlights certain questions with regards to the longer-term outlook for Halon banks. Particularly, we note with some concern that every potential run-out date scenarios provided by the FS talk regarding Halon 1301 has moved closer by 2 to 5 years compared to the last assessment, and in a worst-case scenario, could even be as early as 2030. However, we are happy to hear from the delegate from the EU that Halon seems to be stable, the supply of Halon seems to be stable in that region at this time. But we also note that there is considerable uncertainty pertaining to the level of existing Halon banks and would encourage the sharing of any information that could strengthen the confidence levels of the various scenarios provided by the FS talk. We have also heard yesterday about certain data gaps on emissions, including from the possible use of Halon 1301 as a feedstock. We are encouraged to see that the FS talk has engaged with the International Civil Aviation Organization and the International Maritime Organization with a view to better assess future Halon availability to support civil aviation, and that they will continue to do so. We agree with the recommendation of the FS talk to apply best practices in Halon management in order to ensure responsible use, such as avoiding unnecessary destruction and implementing strategies to reduce emissions. In order to avoid the potential situation where existing banks are depleted before alternatives have been adopted in civil aviation, and there's a need for essential uses of Halon. We are concerned that we may find ourselves unprepared for this to happen sooner rather than later. The FS talk report provides other recommendations that may help better understand the future availability of Halon, and we are taking a close look at these recommendations. As Canada has similar concerns to what we have heard from other delegations from the United States, Australia, and the EU, we would be interested in engaging on the issue either on the margins or in another forum with a view to discuss possible steps forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And before I give the floor to China, I would like to ask if other delegations would to come forward during this agenda item and then press the button so we have a complete list who will speak next. China.
We would also like to thank FS Talk for their work, for the information on the assessment of future availability of Halons and its alternatives. Our delegation has one question regarding the alternatives. In the assessment of the alternative of Halon, CF3I is recognized as one possible alternative. We would like to know that. How about the technical availability or feasibility of CF3I as an alternative to Halons, considering the high toxicity and ODP value? How does FS Talk consider the toxicity and ODP of CF3I? We understand that now the price of CF3I is very high and the viscosity is very high, and application in many scenarios are faced with difficulties. We would like to ask FS Talk, how do you consider the economic and technical feasibility of CF3I? Thank you.
Thank you, China. Let's say I asked if other delegations would like to take the floor. I only have now Burundi, and then I would like to close the list and go to the FS Talk to reply. So first, Burundi.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Ma préoccupation.
Thank you very much. But I
voir si à travers l'OACI, tous les pays sont concernés et nous sommes...
We are worried over the fact that there should be follow-up so that our country is not negatively impacted by transport costs, and our level of development is not thus harmed. For the time being, we don't have much information, but this could have an impact on our economy because substitution costs could be high. Also, we'd like to know where we're headed and where we're going to dispose of the products that we wish to replace. So our concerns are the transport costs and the impact this will have on our economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Burundi. And now I would like to give the floor to FS Talk to the questions that were put forward.
It doesn't come on. But we can't see it. Okay, all right.
I see there's some consultation going on, so let us know when you're ready to answer. Yeah, FS Talk.
Thank you. Turning the microphone on. So CF3I has been looked at by civil aviation as an alternative, potential alternative, for probably 20 plus years now. It is currently being considered only as a potential replacement in the engines and auxiliary power units, which is the smaller of the two remaining Halon 1301 applications that need to find alternatives. We are following the issue carefully of the ozone depletion potential issues related to CF3I, in particular as it relates to refrigeration with direct implications to potentially to fire suppression. We also note that if it is released at aircraft altitudes, its ODP has been even higher. At this point, the civil aviation community is still evaluating it and has not made any direct decisions, does not have any systems to evaluate, but they are continuing to look at this potential development and monitor the environmental issues as it relates to CF3I. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for this reply. And if there are any more questions, parties can also go directly to FS Talk to get some more answers. I would like to conclude this item by saying that we leave it open and parties can consult among each other, and we come back later this week on this agenda item. Then we would like to go to any other issues of 3G. And 5 issues have been brought forward. Emissions of HFC 23, VSLS, destruction technologies, feedstocks, and life cycle refrigerant management, and we will go through them in this order. And co-chair and I will divide among each other who is taking up which item. but I would like to start with the emissions of HFC 23. And USA asked for putting that on the agenda. So USA, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair, for delegates' information. The draft decision is posted. It is CRP 1, and so I will try to briefly run through the content of that. I think, just for a little bit of context, I think the context is laid out in the preambular language. And just to explain sort of the rationale behind our interest, I think you find it really predominantly in the second preambular, which is some recent scientific findings show unexplained increases in emissions of HFC 23 in recent years, and we think that really merits some further consideration and the receipt of additional information by this body. As we all well know, the Quad Assessment Report, as noted in the following preambular, included significant information on HFC 23 emissions. And in addition, we have some additional information that'll come to the meeting of the parties later this year from the TEEP. So moving on to the operational paragraphs, I will just go through them one by one. The first paragraph, frankly, is merely intended to ask for any updated information on HFC 23 that is relevant to the science assessment panel, so thinking of this from an atmospheric perspective. And the reason for that is that there are, in fact, some additional scientific studies going on and results that have been or will be published that go beyond what the 2022 Quad report provided to us. So we see this as very narrow. I think we have the information from the most recent Quad report, but I think they could provide us just a very simple and short supplement to that. So that is the idea behind paragraph 1. Moving on to paragraph 2, and I should have said both for the SAP and the TEEP, the request would be to produce additional reports for the meeting of the parties next year. And moving on to the TEEP, in paragraph 2, there are sort of 4 sub-elements here of items that we would like to see additional information on. The first, under paragraph A, is on potential sources of emissions of 23. And this is from facilities I'll use some shorthand, it's from HFC or HCFC manufacturing facilities, facilities that manufacture other chemicals, and then consumptive uses that may lead to emissions. Subparagraph B talks about additional information on chemical manufacturing other than HFC or HCFC manufacturing that may generate HFC 23 byproduct, including estimates of the scale of such emissions. Subparagraph C tries to get a little bit more detailed information of the quantities of HFC 23 being consumed by country and by sector. And then finally, further information on best practices for reducing emissions of HFC 23, specifically from consumptive uses. And I would say, with respect to this paragraph in particular, we're cognizant we are going to get some additional information from the TEEP at the MOP this year. So I think we, of course, would want to revisit this at the MOP based on what we see. But what we tried to do was to frame these 4 subparagraphs to take the information request beyond that which has already been made to the TEEP. So the idea and the way we have framed this, we believe, is non-duplicative to the existing request. Moving forward to paragraph 3, we would request parties with available information that is relevant to either the SAP or the TEEP report to provide that information to the Secretariat, because then the SAP and the TEEP can take that into consideration. The 4th paragraph really is an encouragement to parties to support scientific efforts and research on atmospheric measurements that are relevant to this. The 5th paragraph encourages, it's sort of a generic encouragement to scientific and atmospheric organizations and institutions to further study these issues. And finally, paragraph 6 requests parties to take appropriate measures to ensure that they are effectively implementing their HFC 23 related obligations under the Kigali Amendment. So I think that introduces it. I did want to say, and I should have led with this, the CRP is submitted on behalf of Australia, Canada, Norway, and the United States. We have consulted with a number of other countries as well, but I'm sure there's broader interest in this in the room. So with that, Co-Chair, I return the floor to you and welcome any thoughts and comments from colleagues in the room.
Thank you by introducing the CRP. So the floor is now open for others on this specific item of HFC 23. India requests for the floor, so please, India.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Let me start by thanking the proponents of the CRP. Regarding the CRP, we need more clarity on unexplained increase in emissions for HFC 23 and how such emissions have been identified. In fact, we did ask this clarification yesterday from SAP. Still, we need to have a better understanding of this issue. Secondly, we also need clarification on other relevant chemicals and consumptive uses that may lead to HFC 23 emissions, and also on best practices to reduce emissions from consumptive uses. Next, we feel that the TEEP-wide decision 34/7 of the MOP has been assigned a task on chemical pathways that could be used in the production of HCFCs or HFCs that may generate HFC 23. The findings of that will be presented at the MOP. We feel that we need to first hear from the TEEP about the findings. Next, we need a better understanding of para 5 of the CRP, which specifically mentioned or proposed to encourage scientific and atmospheric organizations and institutions to further study and elaborate the current findings related to HFC 23 emissions as relevant and appropriate to their mandate, with a view to contributing to the assessment. Here, we want to understand whether the TEEP would approach these various scientific and atmospheric organizations and institutions, or such organizations will be requested to provide the information. Lastly, regarding last para, that para 6 of the CRP, what we understand is that this is a compliance obligation for the parties, and we would like to understand the rationale or logic for reiterating this para in the CRP. We do propose further discussions on this to take it forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and also heard some questions for SAP and TEEP, and so it's good to prepare for that. I come back to you later, SAP and TEEP. So China.
Thank you, Co-Chair. On the emission of HFC 23, the Chinese government attaches great importance to the issue of HFC 23 emissions. In recent years, the Chinese government has actively organized relevant enterprises to carry out HFC 23 emission reduction actions. Since joining the Kigali Amendment in June 2021, China has issued and implemented relevant policies and regulations, organized research, and further improved HFC 23 emission accounting methods, continuously strengthened HFC 23 emission control, and earnestly implemented the Kigali Amendment's HFC 23 control requirements. Our delegation pays great attention to the issue of HFC 23 emissions. We also note the relevant scientific studies on HFC 23 emissions. The time frame for such studies is actually before 2019, when the emissions were not yet part of the HFC 23 control obligations of the Kigali Amendment. It was only after the entry into force of the Kigali Amendment that the HFC 23 control requirements became a new area of work for the parties. In this regard, especially the relevant emission sources and links, control measures, etc., we need to have more comprehensive information to enhance our understanding on the issue and knowledge in this area. We have carefully studied the CRP proposed by the United States on HFC 23. And we have some concerns and questions about the content of this CRP. Our delegation is willing to further exchange and discuss with the sponsors in the contact group on the relevant content of this CRP. I thank you.
Thank you. I don't see any other requests on my list. So, yes, now I see. It's Norway.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. As we heard yesterday, the SAP reported on the levels of HFC 23 in the atmosphere, which has increased since the previous quadrennial report. HFC 23 is a byproduct from production of HCFC 22, and higher emissions of HFC 23 are certainly due to the higher production volumes of HCFC 22. In addition, the TEEP informed us on other possible ways where HFC 23 emissions could occur. Without prejudice to the information that the TEEP will provide us at the MOP later this year, we think that the information from SAP and TEEP in the quadrennial reports is sufficiently alarming for us to start further discussions on this issue at this meeting. And for this purpose, we think it could be very useful to ask the SAP and the TEEP to provide the parties with additional and more quantitative information regarding these emissions and their sources. We also think it would be useful to encourage parties to support scientific efforts, including atmospheric monitoring. We also received useful information on the best practices, and we think it would be appropriate to ask the parties to take appropriate measures to ensure that they are effectively implementing their HFC 23 obligations. So we would support continuing these discussions in a contact group. Thank you.
Thank you, Norway, and I see European Union on my list.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, and as previous speakers have said, we seem to have an issue here that was highlighted by the assessment report. So we read some of those unexplained emissions and sources with some concern. So we think that this CRP has some interesting ideas, and we would like to discuss those. We might have some ideas of our own to contribute. So we would very much like to exchange in a contact group with the proponents and other interested parties. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see any requests for the floor, so I would like to go to SAP, or the US would like to respond first. Then I go to SAP and T, because I see the USA offer the floor.
Actually, co-chair, perhaps go to the SAP first and then to me, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Please. Then SAP and TEEP. There were some questions coming from several delegations on HFC 23. So who can give the answers? SAP, please. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. We did report on HFC 23 in our assessment. There will be a side event on HFC 23 tomorrow at 1 o'clock, lunchtime, in which there'll be some current scientific results presented by my colleague, Dr. Stephen Monska. We, as the SAP, those data will be updated. We certainly have within our capabilities to convene a small subgroup to write an update to the assessment for the MOP next year. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you for this information and also for the side event that will take place tomorrow on this issue. Then TEEP.
Thank you, Co-Chair. There was a question from India asking about, hang on, I have to get the right paragraph in the draft decision, excuse me, in the CRP in relation to para 2, subpara B, asking about any additional information on chemical manufacturing other than HCFCs and HFCs that may generate HFC 23 byproduct emissions, and that information was included in the report when we outlined HFC 23 emissions from the manufacture of tetrafluoroethylene and hexafluoropropene from HCFC 22 feedstock. So that would be the process that we might be able to provide some more information on. Having said that, Norway asked the question or made the statement that they would like more quantitative information from both the TEEP and the SAP, and I'll speak to the TEEP. If we are to provide more quantitative information, we might need more quantitative information from parties, and we would welcome that information. We will be providing our report in response to 34.7 in September this year, which will have more information, and you might see at that stage perhaps where there might be gaps in the information that we have. Thank you.
Thank you. Then I would like to give the floor to the USA.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair, and thanks for several interventions, asking questions or adding to, I think, the dialogue on this issue. I think, as several have suggested, the best path forward, I think, is to move into a small group. But before doing so, I did just want to quickly reflect on a few of the issues that were raised. First, thanks very much to our colleagues from India for your questions. I think the first one sort of related to, you know, kind of the question of this framing on the increase in emissions. I think that was probably partially answered by one of the SAP co-chairs, but just to say, I think Norway also referred to this, but I think the Quad report itself, I think, lays out the basis for part of this concern. There's also a scientific paper from 2020 that looks at some of the global atmospheric trends on HFC 23 emissions and increases in recent years. Now the information is a little bit dated in that study, but that's the rationale for why we had sort of framed this as in the context of a concern about those increases in emissions. And I don't think that's prejudicial at all to the question of, like, we understand the obligations under the Kigali Amendment and the timing of their entry into force. So it's simply meant to be a factual statement rather than any sort of indication that goes beyond that. India had also asked a couple of questions about the references in paragraph 2 to the manufacture of other chemicals. And the reason we're picking up on that is that, you know, the obligations under the Kigali Amendment relate specifically to byproduct control from the manufacture of Annex C Group 1 and Annex F substances, so HCFCs and HFCs. But there are other chemical manufacturing processes that also produce this as a byproduct. And in the MC-Talk report, they specifically listed TFE and HFP. So those were probably, from our perspective, the reason we put this forward, I think, was related to those. But to be clear, the mandate here would not specifically be limited to those. So it would be inclusive of those. But listen, if there's some other processes that are relevant, we're quite open to learning more about those. And I think on consumptive uses in particular, I think the idea is just to get a little bit more data and information beyond sort of standard Article 7 reporting, so that we have and understand. So this is a complex issue, right? We have HFC 23 entering the atmosphere from byproduct emissions, but we're also using HFC 23 in a number of applications. And so as we try to sort of put this scientific picture together to understand what's going on, I think there's several pieces to this. And so the idea is really just to provide us, I think, a more comprehensive picture of what is going on, to be clear, in the information space. So that's really what paragraphs 1 and 2 are trying to do. I think fully understand the point that India raised, that in some sense, paragraph 2 maybe it is premature. I mean, we could have waited and just presented this paragraph at the meeting of the parties, for example. We simply thought it was probably better to get the ideas on the table. To be clear, it is crafted, the intent in crafting this language was to avoid duplication with the report that is coming into the meeting of the parties. I think we did that. I think these are separable items from that. But perhaps just to reassure India, and I mentioned it briefly, listen, we're not going to decide on this here. This draft decision presumably would move forward to the MOP. I think the point's well taken. We would revisit that once we see the report from the TEEP. So perhaps if some of this information is already covered there, we don't think it will be, but if it is, we certainly, when we come to this at the MOP, we would be very willing to revisit, whether this is the right language. But it struck us as useful to just go ahead and get the language on the table here so countries have time to consider it rather than just present it at the MOP. And then two final points India raised. Paragraph 5. So we've used language similar to paragraph 5 in previous decisions, for example, at the 30th MOP. I mean, the idea really is just, and to be clear, this is only in the context of paragraph 1, so this relates to the SAP part of it, not the TEEP. So it's really just to bring in the idea that there are other organizations and institutions that work in this space of atmospheric measurements and monitoring. It's just an encouragement to them to do these types of studies. and then to share the information to contribute to the updated assessment that we had set out for SAP in paragraph 1. I think you had asked, we could probably talk in the contact group about sort of how that would be operated. You know, does the SAP talk to them? Do they talk to SAP? Perhaps we could take that up in the contact group. We don't feel that's obligations on HFC 23. And I think as Norway articulated, we're seeing a lot of it in the atmosphere, and so I think it's just a reminder of the importance of implementing the obligations that all countries that are party to the Kigali Amendment have undertaken on HFC 23. So that was the idea behind that. We hope that's helpful, and we look forward to further discussions in the contact group.
Thank you. I now would like to conclude this item. I think it's indeed good to have further discussions in a contact group, as was requested by several parties. And I think indeed that SAP and TEEP presence would be very useful in that contact group. The announcements, how we organize the contact groups, will be made at the end of this 3G agenda item when we covered all the different topics. So we come back to that. And now I would like to go to Canada on the very short-lived substances. That's the item they introduced, and where there's a CRP available. And it has been, the submission was together with Australia, Switzerland, and the USA. So I think Canada, you have the floor to present the CRP and also present the background of your request.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Yes, I'll be presenting on behalf of Australia, Switzerland, and the US. It's CRP, just to make sure that I get it, CRP4, I believe. Thank you. And it's about short-lived substances. So I'll try to be short myself in my intervention, but I think that, you know, it does require a little bit of context. As we heard yesterday from the scientific assessment panel, very short-lived substances have a significant impact on the ozone layer, particularly in the lowest stratosphere, because they tend to degrade in the troposphere and the lower stratosphere. And it's interesting to note that the lower stratosphere is the area of the stratospheric ozone that has not shown any signs of recovery as compared to the mid-latitudes and the poles. And that's due to a number of factors. But we do think that the SAP report mentions that one positive contributions that could definitely be made to the lower stratosphere and to stratospheric ozone in general would be the reduction, ideally the elimination of very short-lived substances. And if these were eliminated by 2023, which obviously won't happen, but this is the year that's used for comparison purposes by the SAP, it would lead to a small but significant increase in the thickness of the ozone layer, estimated to be 1 Dobson unit. This is equivalent to about half of the impact on the ozone layer that would result from the elimination of all future long-lived anthropogenic ODS emissions in 2023. So individually, it seems to be a more significant action than most of the other options that we have before us to further protect the ozone layer at this stage. Now, it's still, historically, it's not a huge amount because, you know, we have phased out successfully the majority of ozone depleting substances. So obviously, you know, what is left compared to what we phased out historically is not huge, but still, it's it's still something which could have a definite impact, as we've heard, positive impact on the ozone layer. Now, when you look at very short-lived substances, the SAP also indicates that emissions of dichloromethane in particular, DCM represents a large majority of emissions of VSLS. The MC-TOC provides comprehensive and very useful information in its quadrennial report on industrial sources and uses of DCM, as well as other VSLS. So the report also deals with chloroform, DCE, PCE, and for the first time, at least that we're aware of, it provides, it quotes a recent study that has estimated a range of ozone depleting potential for these substances. And for DCM in particular, the range seems to be roughly between 0.01 and 0.02, which is small, but then when you look at the actual emissions, then you know, it's not that small anymore. So according to the estimate in the MC-TOC report, production of DCM in 2020 was around 1.8 million tons. From those 1.8 million tons, about 1.45 million were for emissive uses. So emissive uses of DCM are higher than feedstock uses. And this is mostly what we're concerned with this proposal. It's not aimed at feedstock uses, although you know it could be, but our main concern is about emissive uses because you know these are mostly the one that result in emissions and attack the ozone layer, and they've been growing at a rate of about 10% or more per year. Even though the rate of increase may have slowed down very slightly since the last quadrennial assessment, it's still a very high growth rate. Now, Canada is aware that due to DCM's toxicity, a number of jurisdictions and industries have taken measures to restrict or otherwise reduce the use of DCM, and that in some countries, these have reduced quite considerably in the past 20 years. Now, this shows that there are alternatives to this substance, and it may suggest that DCM emissions could be managed outside of the purview of the Montreal Protocol, as long as its toxicological profile is recognized by countries, by governments, and some action is taken in that regard. However, it does not, in our view, mean that parties to the Montreal Protocol should not be paying more attention to this issue. In terms of its impact on the ozone layer, DCM is a substance that we've been keeping a watching brief for some time. And while Canada at this stage would not support the Montreal Protocol actually controlling the substance, we do think it behooves us to recognize the effect of the substance on the ozone layer and promote some activities that could reduce its use and emissions in the same way that we're doing this for non-controlled uses of substances. So, for instance, we spend time talking about QPS, we take time talking about banks of ODS, which are not controlled under the Montreal Protocol, but we recognize that just because they're not controlled, it doesn't mean we should not take action to try to reduce their environmental impact as much as possible. So having said this, I'll just jump directly now to CRP4. It's a very brief draft decision with the idea that we could come back to this issue perhaps next year and perhaps have also a more in-depth discussion. The first thing it does is it requests the TEEP to include in its 2024 progress report information on alternatives to dichloromethanes and measures to reduce emissions in the main applications where it's used. As well, not forgetting about other very short-lived substances that were discussed in the report by the MC TOC. The decision asked for the TEEP for any relevant updates regarding existing and projected production, use, and emissions of DCM, but also other very short-lived substances. And then the second paragraph simply encourages parties to take action to reduce use and emissions of DCM in applications where alternatives are available and emission control measures are feasible. In some way, this is similar to decisions parties took quite a number of years ago on N-propyl bromide. So N-propyl bromide is the only short-lived substances we think that has been addressed through a decision by the parties. These were decisions 13.7 and decision 18/11, which are recalled in the preamble to this draft decision. The approach that we're suggesting here is not exactly the same as what we did for N-propyl bromide, but it's basically goes in a similar direction. And you know, in the case of NPB, its actual use and emissions were a lot less than what we're talking about here in terms of DCM. So we'd like to put this proposal for the consideration of parties, and we thank our co-sponsors, Australia, Switzerland, and the United States for working with us on this CRP. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you for this presenting the CRP and also the explanation behind it. Are there any requests for the floor? I see India. India, please, you have the floor.
Thanks, Mr. Co-Chair. We thank the proponents for the CRP on short-lived substances. Mr. Co-Chair, we are still going through the different elements of the CRP, and we will come back with our detailed comments on this CRP. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any other requests for the floor? European Union.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, and we thank the proponents of the CRP putting this forward and the very comprehensive explanations on the rationale for this. And we have also read attentively the assessment reports and the issue of dichloromethane. That's been a bit on the radar of the assessment panels for a while. So we would certainly be interested to speak on this topic. Again, we may have some of our own ideas. We may also want to collect some information from parties on any actions that are being taken in order to help this discussion. So we would like to discuss this in some sort of forum, possibly a contact group at this meeting.
Thank you, European Union. Other requests for the floor? I don't see other requests, so I just would like to go back to India, because you asked to have some time to prepare some comments or questions regarding the CRP. What time would you be ready? Would it be if we went through the other items of 3G and come back to this, or do you need more time?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, for giving the floor again. We would be in a position to come back by tomorrow morning.
Okay, thank you. That's good to know. Then we know that, and we also heard the request from the European Union to establish a contact group or to have discussions in a group. So, but then it's good to know when you will come back on this. So. At the end of the at the end of this agenda item, we come back how we would like to bring that forward. Thank you. Then, if there are no other requests for the floor on this item, on the short-lived substances, then I would like to give my co-chair.
Merci beaucoup, Raph.
Thank you very much, Ralph. We're going to take up the item concerning destruction technologies for controlled substances. Following up on the presentations of the quadrennial reports, the parties have identified certain subjects on which they would like to have in-depth discussions. Among these issues, there is the question of destruction technologies. In this respect, the European Union has submitted a CRP, and I would like to ask the European Union to present this CRP to us, and we will then have a discussion on the basis of this document so as to get a better idea of the substance.
L'Union européenne, si vous...
The European Union, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. We have read attentively the recommendations of the TIAP on this matter, and this is what we are trying to take up in this very short and straightforward, we believe, CRP. It is at least partially motivated by our domestic legislation, where we tie ourselves closely to destruction technologies that are approved here. So we have an interest to keep the list of technologies that are approved for destruction as updated as possible, in line with any new information that comes along. So this is behind this request. And so we noted that the TIAP recommends to add one destruction technology, namely cement kilns, to destroy diluted sources of Annex F Group 1 substances, so essentially the HFCs. So our CRP would propose to add this as an approved destruction technology. Secondly, the TIAP tells us there is room for consolidating the list, namely that one technology, portable plasma arc technology, could be grouped under the other existing listed technology, nitrogen plasma arc destruction. Sorry for that. Destruction technology. So we would just take up the recommendation again by removing portable plasma arc technology, knowing that it does not make a difference because any portable plasma arc technology would be listed under the nitrogen plasma arc destruction technology. It just makes our list shorter, more readable, but it doesn't change anything in the number of technologies or the type of technologies that are approved. Further, in subpara 3, we would like that the TIAP would come back to us on the 37th meeting on the parties on new information they have on remaining technologies that have not yet been approved or determined in the list that we have from the 30th meeting of the parties. So we would like them to continue reviewing these technologies and report to us by the 37th meeting of the parties, which is in 2 years' time. And if they do have more information by next year, we would actually like them to come back next year already to us at the open-ended working group because, as I said, we have an interest to have this list as updated as possible for the purposes of our domestic legislation. And as a last point in the CRP, we would invite parties to submit to the Secretariat any information that may be relevant to these destruction technologies in order to be able, the TEEP, to take these into account when they assess technologies. Thank you very much. Sorry. We would be, we would be interested in speaking with other parties at this meeting in the margins. And yes, we would to see how we can make progress on this issue, and that would be our interest, and we will be interested to hear from other parties if that is an acceptable way forward.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, distinguished delegate of the European Union. The European Union has produced a document that basically has 3 parts to it. In the first part, there's a proposal related to the adjustment of existing technology. And in the second part, the European Union would like to have information on technology that has been developed and is available. And thirdly, it would like to have a stock-taking exercise of existing technology and have that be done by the Secretariat. We've heard from the European Union. Do other parties have something to add by way of reactions to the CRP submitted by the European Union? The floor is open.
Je vois.
I see Canada asking for the floor, and India. Canada, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. First, we would like to thank the European Union for preparing this CRP on destruction technologies. And we support the proposed actions as this delegation believes that it is important to identify suitable technologies that can be used for the destruction of waste, ozone-depleting substances, and HFCs. Maybe one question. So we note that the rationale provided by the MC talk for adding cement kilns to the list of approved technologies for diluted sources is that the technology has been demonstrated to meet the DRE criteria, or 99.99% destruction rate, for concentrated streams, and therefore that it should qualify for diluted streams, which requires a lower 95% destruction rate efficiency. Given that this criteria could also be applicable to other destruction technologies on the list, we would expect the MC talk, in preparation of their next review and report, as requested by Para 3 of the draft decision, that they would consider whether other technologies could similarly be approved for diluted sources. So maybe if the MC talk could confirm to us that this is the case, we would be able to support the decision as was submitted by the European Union. But if there's ongoing discussions in the margins, we'd also be interested in participating in those. Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair.
Merci beaucoup à l'honorable.
Thank you very much, Canada. I now give the floor to India.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. And we thank EU for the CRP. The focus areas or the issues which are there in the CRP are indeed the topics or the areas which are of great interest to us also. We would like to see further discussions on this and perhaps through a contact group. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup à l'Inde.
Thank you very much, India. Are there any other parties wishing to take the floor? Any other reactions? I see Cameroon.
We want to thank European Union for this submission, but we still have some concern. And the concern is this technology that's adopted. We're trying to see, I think a couple of, that was yesterday, we raised the issue of handling or making centers of destruction for maybe how to handle issue of destruction of ODS. I don't know if at all the parties should be looking at possibilities of extending some of the centers of destructions, if at all. I'm sure this is a technology, but I think maybe looking at possibility of creating centers so that it will become much more easier for ODSs in areas like the Article 5 parties to see how far they can easily carry their ODSs for those centers to be destroyed. I think I concur with the approach, but we are looking at other subsidiary approach that we could bring more centers. Thank you very much, Co-Chair.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Cameroon. I think this CRP has aroused a great deal of interest among the various speakers, and the parties that have spoken have pointed out that there is still a major need to have in-depth discussions on the CRP. The United States asking for the floor now. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, and we appreciate the European Union putting this decision forward, the CRP forward, and we agree with their suggestion on consultations in the margins as perhaps the best possible path forward. I think we want to just take a look at this decision in light of other decisions that give direction to the TEEP to keep technologies for destruction under review. I think, and I'll have to confirm this, but I think decision 3015 may have been the last decision that looked at this. So we just want to make sure that we have an opportunity to consider this decision with them to ensure that decisions that already call for the TEEP to keep technologies under review perhaps are important for us to make sure that we are consistent with those and that we are thoughtful about not providing additional direction where it's not clear. I mean, we all have our role at home on how we are taking things forward in our own regulations domestically. So we'll just want to make sure, though, that direction to the TEEP on their work to keep the parties up to date on advances in various matters, including in providing the parties with information on destruction technologies. If it's already covered by a prior decision, we want to make sure that we are not giving somehow direction that could be then misleading in some way or read inconsistent with past decisions. And our suggestion, like the EU had suggested, is to consult on the margins. Thank you.
Merci à l'honorable délégué.
Thank you, United States. Are there any other parties asking for the floor? Egypt and Australia. So at this point, are there any other parties still wishing to speak? Could you please indicate your interest in speaking so that we can have a final list?
Egypt,
Egypt, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair, and good afternoon, everyone. We also thank the European Union for this CRP, and indeed, the destruction technology is a great challenge to many countries, especially some developing country like my country. We do have many cement factory, but unfortunately, they are hesitated to take any fluorine, chlorine substance because this affects the quality of the final product. So we need guidance and we need to have a sound management technology and to confuse or to confirm our partner and also to encourage us to collect the unwanted ODSs. So we are in favor of this, of course. Thank you very much, Co-Chair.
Merci beaucoup à l'Égypte.
Thank you very much, Egypt. There are still 2 speakers on the list, Australia and Senegal. And I will close the list there. So Australia first and then Senegal. At this stage, are there any other parties wishing to speak still? Could you please let us know? Oh, I see Pakistan. Thank you. Australia, you have the floor. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair, and good afternoon to everyone. We would like to thank the EU for picking up this recommendation from the TEEP. We saw this recommendation come forward in their assessment report, and we are glad to see it being acted upon and thank the EU for their attention to this issue. I think, like others, we generally agree with the thrust of the CRP, and certainly the first couple of operative paragraphs we would agree with, as they're entirely consistent with the recommendations from the TEEP. In relation to operative paragraph 3, which is about further assessment of destruction technologies, I think we hear the concerns expressed by the USA, and I think we would like to echo those concerns in terms of making sure that we are not giving duplicative or inconsistent guidance to the TEEP on this issue. So we think that probably this issue can be resolved with a margins discussion, and we would like to proceed in that way. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Merci beaucoup à l'honorable délégué.
Thank you, distinguished delegate from Australia. Senegal has asked for the floor. Senegal has the floor. Thank you, Co-Chair. We'd also like to thank the European Union and Cameroon and Egypt for their statements. Egypt has touched on an important point, and he's right, in terms of CFC or HCFC. These are stable molecules. This means that when they're put in cement factories, a lot of energy is used, and this affects the quality of production. And what he said was right. Now, there's another technology that is plasma destruction, and that is technology in the forefront, which costs a lot and requires high-level expertise. I'm not saying we don't have that expertise, but what we do need, because since we've been talking about CFCs, HCFCs, that's more than 15 years now, and after the Kigali Amendment, we'll have to move forward quickly because CFC stocks plus stocks of HCFC that are much bigger are supplemented by others, then our countries will be overwhelmed. What does this mean? We will need to move towards the establishment of regional destruction facilities. Why do I say regional? Because an inventory has been done, and this was mentioned in the TEEP report, and that's a good thing. Countries are going to do this, and it's a good thing because it will allow for the stock taking to be done, and that's a good point of departure. On that basis, if you take one country and you introduce a center there, then it will not be able to be profitable, because even if what has been collected will be important for the country, but it will not be sufficient. What is important is to pool the collection, that is, have a regional center for Senegal and Mali and Guinea, for example, Mauritania, and then collect all the materials and have one country and put a regional center there and take all of the materials there. That is a suggestion. But the next issue is who will pay for this? It's one thing to establish a regional destruction facility, but that will cost something and it will require maintenance. So one has to look at the whole chain. And having one facility is a good thing, but making it work costs something, and you have to train experts and staff. All of that is a package which will have to be thought through. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup à l'honorable.
Thank you, distinguished delegate of Senegal. There are 3 countries that are still on our list: Pakistan, Kenya, and Nepal. And after Nepal, the list will be closed. But before I give the floor to Pakistan, I would like to revert to the distinguished delegate of Senegal and understand things a bit more clearly. You talked about the establishment a destruction center or facility. Are you talking about a regional center for Africa? Or say just for the Article 5 countries or the ones also covered by Article 2? I think that requires a bit of clarification. Could you just be a bit more specific in your proposal? Senegal. Now, with the elimination of CFCs and with the elimination of HCFCs, there are much greater stocks. With the elimination of HCFC, these are 2 categories of stocks that will come into our countries. Now, it's been mentioned in the report of TIP that in a very short time, the stocks in Article 5 countries will surpass the Article 2 countries' stocks. This means that this will cause problems which will have to be tackled right now. So what I've said is that in each of our countries, we have stocks. For example, if we look at African countries and we want to establish a center and we put it in a single country, the stocks will be there, but there will not be enough available to actually get the destruction facility working. What you need is to have a critical amount so as to ensure that the facility actually is operating and is profitable. The idea is to have a regional center somewhere. Regional, I'm talking about Africa. You'd have to see where it would be situated, but there would be something that would be viable rather than having one country, one facility. That's what I'm talking about. Say, you go to a side event, you see that there are companies that have the technology. We can help you, but it's a question of quantities being sufficient to have the work be done. And this is what has inspired me to suggest that there be regional centers, for example, in West Africa for somewhere. The countries in that area would pool their collections and send everything to the same center. I don't know if it's clear or not. No. It's still not clear to you? Co-chair, thank you. We will continue with our list. After these statements, we will now give our point of view on the situation. But we'll go on, first of all, with Pakistan.
Pakistan.
Pakistan. Go ahead, you have the floor.
Thank you, Co-Chair. We would like to thank EU for the CRP, which merits due consideration. Pakistan supports finalization of destruction technology as we are heading towards the phase-out of HCFCs and expecting end of life of rack equipment in coming years. But it would be more beneficial to have more than one agreed destruction technologies to ensure economic viability. Moreover, cost effectiveness of destruction with cement kilns and plasma arc technology may be assessed in detail first, along with destruction efficacy ratio. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Merci.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the distinguished delegate of Pakistan. Kenya now. Thank you, Co-Chair. We wish to also thank EU for the CRP on destruction technology. This delegation hopes the technologies to be considered would take into consideration small quantities of ODS and HFCs to be disposed of by countries like Kenya. The industry and private sector in Kenya has also been very keen and inquiring about the issue of destruction technology. Kenya supports the CRP and would like to take part in the discussions in the contact group. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Thank you. Benin.
Benin, please.
Merci bien.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We too would like to convey our gratitude to the European Union for their proposals. Well, I don't want to paraphrase what was said by Senegal and previous speakers who touched on the instruments which were included in yesterday's report. But we are facing a number of very real problems. Certain countries, the R12 stock, still have stocks. Now, most countries have moved over to the final phase of the phase-out of HCFCs. So the R22, and there will be more and more of this as we move forward to complete phase-out. The objective, of course, is that this R22 not be used anymore and that alternatives be used instead. Now, with the progress of HFC and the implementation of the phase-out product, we'll have more and more R22 stocked. And if one does stock them, how will one manage this? So it's very important that we consider the management of these substances. It's very important. And for this reason, I would like to back most of the proposals heard. Of course, the instruments available is another problem. I referred to it yesterday, but the experts didn't provide us with a comprehensive answer. However, a sustainable solution will have to be found for us African states. It's very important. We have certain structures which were discussed during the various COPs. It often involved the experience of other countries, but the problem here is the volume. Not every country has the same volume of materials that need to be transported. And so why are we stocking things? To destroy the environment? So I really urge our experts to continue the exercise in consideration and come up with innovative technology over and beyond existing technology. And we have to find a program, come up with a program for the management of these chemicals, just like with all other chemicals. Thank you. Thank you so much, the distinguished delegate of Benin. Now, as we end our questions and answers session, I believe the conclusion is that there are concerns regarding the destruction technologies for controlled substances. States would like to enjoy more information. They would like to be assisted in this process of destruction of refrigerants. And to do this, we would propose that discussions continue. Discussions regarding destruction technologies for controlled substances, but what we're considering for now is that informal discussions take place. Informal discussions which will allow us to revisit this issue during the course of this week, perhaps even as early as tomorrow. We're going to revisit this to ensure that we're able to come up with a lasting way to have more in-depth discussions in a more formal format. So we're going to work on this. But what we're going to do now is to move swiftly on to the next issue.
Nous allons à présent aborder la question relative.
We're now going to look at the issue of feedstocks for the production of other substances. We are referring here to the feedstocks. Now I'm going to turn to Australia. Australia, who probably is in a position to share very interesting information with us. Distinguished delegate of Australia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair. I am glad that you have predefined it as interesting. Others might not necessarily agree. But thank you for the floor, and thank you for the opportunity to introduce our thoughts on this important issue. We have noticed in the various assessment reports and the presentations that have been provided to us, numerous concerns that actually are threaded together by the increased use of ozone-depleting substances, particularly for feedstock or the production of ODS for feedstock uses. A review of those reports and presentations highlight issues associated with production of controlled chemicals and their use for feedstock. And I'll just run through some brief examples. You know, there is a large increase in the use of controlled substances for feedstocks, particularly HCFC 22 and CTC, but also various CFCs, which present opportunities for increased emissions of these substances to atmosphere if their emissions are not strictly managed. Production of ODS for feedstock uses has increased by 75% over the last 10 years. We note the increased concentration of HFC 23 in the atmosphere, in part as a result of the production of HCFC 22 for feedstock uses. We note the lack of decrease in CTC concentrations in the atmosphere for years, quite likely related to its increased use as a feedstock for HFC, HFOs and other chlorine-containing compounds being produced. We see the global abundances of minor CFC species in the atmosphere are increasing, emissions which are put down in part to leaks of feedstocks or as byproducts of feedstock production. There is an increased use of short-lived substances not controlled by the Montreal Protocol as feedstocks. For example, dichloromethane, which Canada has addressed already at this meeting, which could lead to ozone layer depletion. And we also see that halon 1301 concentrations in the atmosphere are not reducing at the rate expected. And emissions from its increasing use as a feedstock is one explanation for this lack of change. Each of these issues individually is of concern, but collectively they point to a larger systemic issue with feedstocks. The panel reports highlight as one of its three main concerns the rapidly expanding use of ODS and HFCs as feedstocks and their consequent emissions. The SAP suggests that if ODS emissions, feedstock emissions were to be eliminated in future years, the return of effective stratospheric chlorine to 1980 levels could be advanced by 4 years. It also says that better understanding and monitoring of emissions of controlled substances from production, by-production and feedstock use is important, given their contribution to overall global emissions. The use of controlled chemicals as feedstocks has been omitted from calculations of consumption and production on the understanding that emissions from feedstock uses were negligible. I think it becomes clear from the reports that we're seeing from our scientific and technical panels that this is no longer the case. While parties are considering individual chemicals of concern more recently, such as emissions of CTC and HFC-23 and DCM, parties last considered the issue of feedstocks as a whole at the 24th meeting of the parties nearly 10 years ago. And we think it's time for parties to take a fresh look at the issue of feedstocks, informed by science and technical advice, and to rethink our approach. The parties suggest that better understanding and monitoring of emissions of controlled substances from production of feedstock uses, byproduct emissions, emissions of controlled substances as intermediates, and feedstock use is important, and we agree that information is a good place to start our considerations. We are interested in the view of the delegations on this issue, and we would like to hear from them either during this discussion or in the margins with a view to finding a way forward on this issue and in development of a possible CRP. Thank you very much, Co-Chair.
Merci.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the distinguished delegate of Australia. We have listened to the proposal which was just made, and we listened to the ideas which were raised. What we're going to do now is we're going to turn to the parties, and we're going to see whether there are any comments, responses, reactions. The floor is yours.
Switzerland. Vous avez la parole.
Thank you. We would like to thank the Australian delegation for putting forward this important topic of feedstocks. We have been discussing individual aspects of feedstocks in the last couple of meetings. One of them will appear later this week under agenda item 8. I think it's a very good moment to take a broader view on this issue. We have a lot of individual and precise discussions on some specific cases, but this problem might be similar with, as the Australian delegation pointed out, for very different kinds of processes where feedstocks are used. So Switzerland is very much interested in following up this discussion with Australia and other interested parties, and would welcome if a contact group would be established. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the distinguished delegate of Switzerland. We're now going to yield the floor to Norway.
Thank you, Co-Chair. And we would like to thank the distinguished delegates of Australia to raise this issue, and also to already give us a clear and comprehensive picture of what this is about. As we expressed in our statement yesterday, this is clearly for us one of the major challenges for this body to address, and we think this issue definitely merits more attention and discussion among parties. We also recall that there were some valuable reflection on this matter at the workshop on Sunday, and we think it would be useful to draw from those. We would also like to support further discussion in an appropriate way on this matter. Thank you.
Thank you. Nous donnons la parole.
We're now going to give the floor to the European Union. European Union?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, and thank you to, and thanks to the Australian delegation for having taken this initiative. As you know, the European Union has always shown keen interest in discussing this issue, and we will here on the agenda, under the agenda point monitoring, related presentation from TEEP, which is another element going in the same direction. We have a strong interest in engaging with parties on a fruitful discussion, and would like to contribute to it actively.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much. I'm now going to give the floor to Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. We also would like to thank the Australian delegation for raising this issue, the issue of feedstock, and emissions from the production of controlled substances from feedstock was certainly one that was addressed substantively in the report by the MC talk. And I think we're now getting a level of information on the chemical pathways that lead to emissions and on the scale of the associated emissions that we didn't necessarily have before. And based on this information, we think it warrants to have a discussion on this issue. We don't have any, particular ideas at this stage, to be honest, in terms of, what is it that parties could be doing or should be doing on the issues of feedstock. We think it's a very complex issue, and we need to discuss it, but we need to discuss it on the basis of information, hopefully with interested parties, but also experts from the technical panels to respond perhaps to questions we have. As has been noted first by Switzerland, that this issue also relates to agenda item 8B on carbon tetrachloride, which is one of the key substances that's still being produced, an ODS still being produced for feedstock. And I think, as the European Union just mentioned, agenda item 7B in terms of the report to decision 34/5 on chemical pathways and sources of industrial emissions. These issues are all related, and I think, when we go through these other agenda items, we're not sure what would be the best way of proceeding, but there may be value in having a group that, addresses these three agenda items maybe together, because it may be challenging if we address each one of them separately, given there's a lot of overlap in terms of the uses that we're talking about here. One thing we would want to maybe point out is that it's fine to characterize the issue as one of feedstock. We're not sure when the SAP provided its estimate of emissions from feedstock, from controlled substances, if in fact these are emissions from the use of substances as feedstock, or from the production of substances which are then used as feedstock, and also from the production of substances, like for instance HCFC22 and HFCs are produced for controlled uses. And I think it's important to note that from the TEEP report that was prepared in response to decision 34/5, that the actual production of the substances for both feedstock and control uses are provided even higher emission ranges than the actual use of the feedstock than in various processes. So I think it's important to keep in mind that there's these two elements there, and it's perhaps not quite differentiated in the estimate of emissions that we have from the SAP, or perhaps it is, and we also need maybe the SAP to explain this to us a little bit more. But and I'm not saying now, but as we further discuss this issue, I think it's going to be important to be able to differentiate the emissions that are coming from different processes. So just to say that this delegation is interested in being part of the discussion, and that we know that it has it crosses over with a couple of other agenda items that are being considered at this meeting. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much to the distinguished delegate of Canada, who provided a great deal of clarification regarding this item. It is true that the issue of these substances is one which needs to be discussed, because these are substances which one finds at various stages and which behave like contaminants. And we require a clear understanding regarding these substances, the parameters within which they contaminate the environment, their impact on health. We even referred to the link to agenda item 8. So all of this means that we do require further constructive discussions on this issue. However, we here at the level of the Secretariat, we do have one concern, namely, we don't have any documents. There's no skeleton which would serve to guide us in our exercises in consideration. Could you perhaps tell us whether you are considering to engage in discussions and perhaps lead these discussions and then craft a more elaborate document?
Australia, please.
Indeed, I think that was our thought, was to actually have discussions with parties that had intervened to determine a scope and some points that might be of interest, and then use those discussions to develop a CRP for consideration. I think we were looking specifically at an information type of gathering exercise. I think that's what the SAP and the TEEP had proposed, that more information would be useful. So I think we were certainly looking at something along those lines for this meeting. But certainly we're very happy to engage with the countries that have intervened, and perhaps a couple of others besides, in determining what a CRP might look like. I can't guarantee the timetable of this, though. There's a lot else on at this meeting, but we will do our best. But please have patience. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup à l'honorable.
Thank you so much to the distinguished delegate of Australia. This is a good step forward. Thank you so much. Nepal.
Thank you so much for the floor. As this is the first time, I would like to thank the Government of Thailand, Secretariat for this opportunity, and all the research persons. My concern is related with the rate of recovery and the reclaimed, newly produced, the item and the recovery reclaimed, the quantification mechanisms. I think it's very clear. At the same time, chances of ODS release in the troposphere during the recovery and reclaim. It needs to be more analyzed and more clarified. Having said this, I want to stop here. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the distinguished delegate of Nepal. Now, would any other parties wish to make any comments, suggestions perhaps? I don't see anyone. In this case, we are going to urge continued discussion to ensure that a leitmotif be identified, as well as a methodology for the technologies be identified, and then all of this should be crafted into a CRP. Perhaps by tomorrow, after tomorrow, as you see fit. And this would allow us to really consider this issue in a much more formal way. So, what I'm going to do now is going to hand back to my co-chair for the next item.
Thank you, Fiedeme. Next item under 3G and the last item is life cycle refrigerant management. And Micronesia put that on the agenda, so I think I would like to give the floor first to Micronesia.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Our delegation has chosen to spotlight the topic of life cycle refrigerant management at this meeting based on the opportunity that a systemic approach to managing refrigerants could provide to supporting compliance with the Kigali Amendment and secure additional climate and economic benefits. Currently, there are numerous elements of life cycle refrigerant management, including servicing measures to address leakage, technologies for reclaiming, recycling, and reusing refrigerants, and technologies for destruction that are simply not being employed despite the variety of benefits that these measures offer to the atmosphere and to local economies. Because of these opportunities, our delegation would like to encourage a deeper conversation among parties about what could be done to enable parties to do more in this regard. It is our firm belief that without explicit concerted action within the protocol, many of these opportunities will be lost or inaccessible. We are all aware that leakage and venting of controlled substances contribute to climate change. We also now know that destruction is not a compliance obligation. However, the assessment panel reports are explicit that, number one, quantities available for recovery will increase, and number two, timely efforts to establish and finance end-of-life management capacity to prevent HFC emissions could have a significant impact. We wish to hear from others what their views are on what we can feasibly do within the Montreal Protocol to enhance and improve sustainable management of the refrigerants that we are responsible for. Depending on this interest, we might see what the best way forward would be, whether the issue merits a CRP to work to a decision, and we are prepared to offer an initial draft of a CRP, or whether elements can be discussed within the context of one of the ongoing agenda items towards decision for the meeting of the parties. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you for introducing this topic. And I see Grenada would like to react on that. Grenada and afterwards Samoa.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. And Mr. Co-Chair, since this is the first time that I am actually taking the floor for this meeting, I too would like to join the echo of choruses that extend my compliments to the government and people of Thailand for the warm hospitality, and of course to the Ozone Secretariat for the excellent arrangements so far, and again to congratulate both of you as co-chairs of this meeting. With regards to the agenda item and the most recent intervention or proposal from Micronesia, I would like to support the intent of the proposal that has been put forward, and to say that my country is in full support of any initiative in this particular area. Further, I would like to be considered for any engagements that is being proposed with this particular area, as my country also has some ideas and initiatives that we would want to engage under this particular agenda item. We also have been looking at the proposals from the European Union relative to this particular topic, and may also want to engage as to see how we can participate in that particular idea as well. But for sure, we would like to further engage with Micronesia and other interested persons on this particular topic, as we want to reiterate that this particular item is considered under Decision 28/2, the Kigali Amendment, and in more recent times we've seen some initiatives being taken at the Multilateral Fund Executive Committee level, and we have our own ideas as to how we can be involved and promote this issue as well. I just want to reiterate as I end my intervention that this particular issue of end-of-life treatment of refrigerants is one of the very sore issues in the work of a national ozone unit and national ozone officers. As we have been working with the sector and with our technicians in particular as to how we can manage these refrigerants, but we cannot provide them with the ultimate solution as to what to do with these recovered, stored, and unreusable refrigerants. And so any initiatives under this body and any engagements in that particular area, we would very much like to be a part of, and hence the reason why we are making this intervention now, so that we can look to see what additional support that this august body can provide in this particular area. And so we would like very much to keep this item open and to continue with the discussions with Micronesia and others with reference to how we can proceed in addressing this particular issue. Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you for this concise intervention, and I would like to give the floor to Samoa.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I first take this opportunity to thank the Ozone Secretariat for the tireless efforts in organizing this meeting and getting us all here this week. And we also want to acknowledge with appreciation the warm hospitality of the government of Thailand. With regards to the agenda item being discussed, we would like to echo support with any assistance towards life cycle refrigerant management, as alluded to by the distinguished delegate from FSM. We believe the effective management of refrigerants from adoption to use to servicing to end of life provides numerous benefits in areas such as energy efficiency, preventing climate change, stability of rack industries, improved rack servicing, reduced leakage, economic benefits, to name a few. We believe in understanding how to best manage life cycle of refrigerants. We can certainly promote our phase-out schedules effectively at the national level, thus ensuring that we meet our obligations under the protocol. We are currently a mass user of HFCs, and with the Kigali Amendment and the phase-down of HFCs and limited alternatives available to some of the sectors in our region, we foresee that we would want to salvage every amount of refrigerant that we can to meet our phase-out targets through recovery and recycling, and actually know what to say to the general public with what we're doing. So I believe in this light, we would welcome further discussions with interested parties in
Other requests for the list? Yes, there's one coming, Ecuador and Canada. And I also would like to urge if others who want to respond that they clearly indicate it now, because then we can wrap up afterwards. So Ecuador, Canada, and the US. So Ecuador, please, you have the floor.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Chair. Since this is the first time my delegation has taken the floor, I'd like to thank the government of Thailand and the Ozone Secretariat for organizing this meeting. I would like to extend my support to the Micronesian proposal to establish targets related to the management of the life cycle of refrigerants. Our country is initiating a project of a regional center for refrigerants. We think this is an interesting and appropriate alternative to obtain mitigation through the use of refrigerants that are already used. We'd also like to support the EU proposal to include as a valid technology destruction in cement kilns for substances that have already been used. We have carried out a project of reconversion of refrigerators using higher efficiency equipment where there has been CFC-12 recovered and others have been destroyed in cement kilns, achieving a recovery of 2.5 tons of CFC-12, and the destruction in cement kilns means a high level of recovery, and we think these should be included in the Montreal Protocol in an integrated way. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just to be clear that this is the list. I have Canada, USA, and then Nigeria. And then I would like to, and Trinidad and Tobago, and then I would like to close it. Okay, Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, and we also would like to thank Micronesia for bringing this issue to our attention. We understand that this is a matter that is of importance for them, and as we heard from a number of other Article 5 countries. So we're certainly open to have a discussion on this issue. We're not sure, what would exactly be the forum, if it connects to other agenda items. We're not sure. We think the proposal by the EU is really limited to making updates to the list of approved destruction technologies, so it's not necessarily as wide as what is being discussed here, which is a life cycle of refrigerants. We think what we would be aiming for is to understand maybe more precisely where the actual issues, the actual problems and challenges are in countries, noting that under the Multilateral Fund there has been assistance that has been provided, not necessarily for the full life cycle, but for a large part of the cycle of refrigerant management. For the past 30 years, the fund has been providing assistance to countries for the servicing, for the recovery, the recycling, and in some cases the reclamation of refrigerants. So that's, always been part of first refrigerant management plans, then HCFC phase-out management plans, and we think that this kind of assistance is going to continue under the Kigali implementation plans. Now, where somewhat less assistance and less attention has been paid is on the end of the cycle when it comes to end of life. So really the disposal of substances that for whatever reason cannot be reclaimed or cannot be reused. On that issue, I think it's useful to remember that between 2010 and 2015, under the Multilateral Fund, a number of pilot projects, somewhere like about 15 pilot projects, were implemented in countries to collect and destroy unwanted controlled substances, and that there was a funding window that was open to all countries to apply for projects, and about 15 projects were approved, including one regional, or more than one, a couple of regional projects actually. And some of these projects yielded some interesting results. Others experienced challenges. Some of the challenges were due to the collection of the substances that may have required end-of-life management, such as disposal or destruction. But another challenge was just in terms of actually identifying sufficient quantities of waste that would provide some economies of scale to justify investments in destruction. And I think for many of these projects, the ambition at the beginning was high in terms of the amount of controlled substances that would require end-of-life management, but several of them in the end were only able to collect and identify limited amount of controlled substances. So what has been discussed most recently within the executive committee is that maybe before doing more of these projects, countries should spend more time in developing inventories, identifying the actual quantities of controlled substance which are coming to the end of life and that cannot be reused. And in that respect, at the 91st meeting, the executive committee established a funding window for the preparation of national inventories of banks of used or unwanted controlled substances, and to also develop a plan for the collection, transport, and disposal of such substances, including consideration of recycling, reclamation, and cost-effective destruction. So I think as a first step, this really addresses the life cycle management of refrigerants. This funding window is open for all Article 5 countries. Now we can talk also about what non-Article 5 countries have been doing on this issue. I mean, we think it's an issue which should be of relevance to both A5 and non-A5 countries. But just to say, we should keep in mind what we already are doing, and the reason why we're proceeding in this manner is precisely because the experience that we have acquired up to now is that we should first develop an inventory and plan in order perhaps then to get to the next steps, depending on the contents of these inventories and how much the quantities that are actually identified for disposal. So I thought it was to just be useful to recall this recent agreement at the executive committee to establish this funding window, because I think when you take that together with the assistance that's being provided under HPMPs and KIPs for refrigeration management, we do think that the whole life cycle is being considered in the work that we're doing, at least under the multilateral fund. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to give the floor to the USA.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair, and our thanks to Micronesia, I think, for raising this important issue, which I think contributes, I think, in a really important way towards our goals of ozone layer and climate protection. I think what I would say is we're very interested and willing to engage in a discussion either here or at the meeting of the parties on this topic. We do have probably some specific thoughts, but I think we'd probably wait to hear a little bit more from Micronesia and others about the specifics of the issues that they want to discuss before we would jump into those. So our appreciation. Thank you, Micronesia, for bringing this up, and we're very willing and happy to engage on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Then the floor is for Nigeria.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. And I would like to thank Micronesia for bringing up this issue. The emission of greenhouse gases is very high in this area, and any refrigerant not recovered, reclaimed, or recycled is assumed to be released into the atmosphere. And as such, my delegation wishes to support any assistance to life cycle refrigerant management. Thank you.
Thank you for being so concise. Trinidad and Tobago, and then I already closed the list, so Trinidad and Tobago.
Like those before me, this delegation would like to express appreciation to Micronesia for putting forward this issue on life cycle management. This is a great stepping stone for progress. As we are aware, this has been a thorny issue for parties that have stockpiles of recovered gas. Therefore, we would like to show support and be considered in the development of this issue. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Thank you. I think we concluded this part also of that agenda item 3G. I just would like to consult a little bit here behind the desk, and then we come back to you and continue the meeting. Just have a moment of patience. Thank you. We let you waiting for a couple of minutes, but just to recap some elements of agenda item 3G. It almost merits a separate OEWG when you see what is the interest of these, of all the parties. All interesting and important items that came up also during the, let's say, the quadrennial assessment. On emissions of HFC 23, there was indication for a contact group, and we would like to give the room and the time available will be later on the screen, probably tomorrow morning, and the co-chairs of this contact group will be Heidi Stockhaus from Germany and Chantal Wellington from Barbados. So that's one. For the very short-lived substances, we come back tomorrow morning because there was some, especially India, asked to have some time to look at that, and then we propose a way forward from that. On destruction technologies, the idea is also to have informal discussions and see how that how that develops. Feedstock, it's the same, also informal discussion. There was a lot of interest in that, and there were also indications that it's related to different agenda items as well that will be coming up tomorrow. And the same is for the life cycle refrigerant management, to have informal discussions in the margins. So all those last, destruction, feedstock, and life cycle management have discussions in the margins, and maybe something comes out of that, and then we can proceed from there. This is how we would like to proceed. We have to bear in mind it's the second day. We have still a long agenda for us to go through. And we envisaged a whole day of contact group for Thursday, but it could be in jeopardy at the time that we need for all the agenda items. They are very important, that's clear, but it's also that we have to speed up a little bit. So if there are no requests for the floor, I would like to go to the agenda item 5 and take some time for that on the strengthening of the Montreal Protocol institutions. For this agenda item 5, we take both A and B together because it's about outcomes of the workshop and the background documents that the Secretariat prepared. This workshop was a very lively workshop and a lively debate, and we heard a lot of new issues coming up on Sunday. The rapporteurs reported back during the workshop, and there is also a document available with the outcomes of that workshop. It's document 45/6, and at least it's available now in English, and other translations will be available shortly. The background documents that the Secretariat prepared, there are several of them, a background information paper on the workshop, a note summarizing illegal trade practices and approaches, and a note on common features of licensing systems. The rapporteurs are also available here in the room, as well as the Secretariat who organized the workshop, Liazat. So I would like to have not the whole time till 6 o'clock, because we would like to start at 5:45 with the contact group and the terms of reference, So we have still some time before the reception for that group. So I would like to open the floor for comments and on the workshop we had and institutional strengthening, and to hear some ideas for delegations. And if we cannot finalize, we will continue tomorrow, but I would really like to speed up a little bit to have at least some interventions already now on institutional strengthening agenda item 5. Please. I don't see anybody requesting for the floor yet. Yes, Malaysia.
Mr. Co-Chair, thank you. My delegation found the one-day workshop on strengthening the effective implementation and enforcement of the Montreal Protocol is very fruitful and beneficial to my country. For the past 34 years, Malaysia is fully complying with all the obligations under the Montreal Protocol since the rectification of protocol coordination, cooperation, capacity building, and continuous engagement among the custom and other agencies as well as industries are the key success of the compliance. Indeed, the National Ozone Unit of Malaysia also utilized the function of the IPIC, and this gives early information to the enforcement team to stop the illegal trade. Through IPIC in 2020, we had successfully stopped the illegal importation of SCFC 123 to Malaysia. Mr. Co-Chair, to further enhance and improve the effectiveness of combating the illegal trade of ODS and HFC, we are thinking of the future workshop. The Secretariat could include custom and other enforcement agencies such as port authorities that have custody of the port and free trade zone at the port area for the party to share and exchange experience in combating the illegal trade. Finally, Malaysia will continue its efforts and support new measures to strengthen the effective implementation and enforcement of the Montreal Protocol for continuous compliance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Malaysia. Other parties who would like to take the floor? India?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. We would like to thank the Ozone Secretariat for organizing that workshop on 2nd July 2023. That was indeed very useful, and the presentations made and the discussions during the workshop, that was highly informative. Mr. Co-Chair, reporting formats under Article 7 and CPPR are quite comprehensive. So we feel that emphasis should be on strengthening the national frameworks for data collection, compilation, and reporting. Towards this, there is a need for the capacity building of customs officials regarding export-import data compilation, especially during data classification among the various trade classification harmonized system codes. Mr. Co-Chair, regarding the feedstock use of controlled substances, most countries have a mechanism for detailed scrutiny of the process and the application of such substances, and such mechanisms could be examined and strengthened further. Thank you, Co-Chair.
Thank you, India. Senegal?
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair. In fact, we would also like to thank the Secretariat very much indeed for this workshop that was organized and that allowed us to learn a lot and benefit greatly therefrom. What I wanted to stress was that to combat illegal trade, there is a link between customs in our countries. It is the customs that control the entry of goods, both at ports and airports. So what is the link when goods are seized, when they are not managed properly? This is the question we raised earlier. There are there's much greater motivation in some cases, but if there are seizures and there is no monitoring of what the stocks have, where they've ended up, vigilance and motivation decline. This is why I think it is important to have all of these tools and all of these measures in place to combat illegal trading, but we have to have a link between that illegal trade and what the customs is doing in terms of its seizures of goods. If the seizures are properly managed, then I think everything else will fall into place. Thank you very much.
Thank you. USA.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. And our thanks to the Secretariat for organizing the one-day workshop and for the rapporteurs and facilitators for helping guide the day. Given you are taking up both 5A and 5B together, we are going to refer both to the workshop and the paper in noting that there were a number of issues that came up in both places in the paper that the Secretariat prepared and the other background materials the Secretariat prepared that really highlight and build on the discussions we had last year, both at the open-ended working group and at the meeting of the parties. We had a lengthy list of topics that we started with, and we focused our attention on a few of those topics with the idea that we would have an opportunity to discuss some of the other issues as well. We wanted to focus our attention on the outcomes of the discussion that were really about preventing illegal trade. We had noted during the discussion at the workshop there was a difference in the language that was used in the decision we took last year at the meeting of the parties that focused on sharing information, not just when cases are fully proven, but to share information if possible, where possible, in advance of that, so that parties could better understand illegal trade practices that they may experience in their region, to share that information with other parties to help us better prevent illegal trade in the first instance from happening. We wanted to highlight this because it is different than the approach we had taken on ODS, and to highlight that the Secretariat, I think, is in the process of beginning to find ways to share that information either on the website or in other ways. We think that it's worth a follow-up discussion on these matters, as well as some of the other matters that came up on during the workshop and in the paper. For example, on the common features of successful licensing and quota systems, as well as some of the other areas that were highlighted in the discussion. We think this is worth a discussion if the co-chairs and secretariat are able to find an opportunity for that to happen. We would suggest it may be worth finding some time, perhaps for an informal group to meet with a designated time and room so that it is an opportunity to bring parties together. Given the number of participants we saw here at the workshop and the active engagement they took throughout the course of the day on Sunday, we think that there is certainly a continuing interest in a discussion. So we would suggest if the Secretariat could work with if the co-chairs agree and can work with the Secretariat, perhaps to find, even if it's just a short time, but perhaps there is an opportunity for those that are interested to continue to work through some of these issues and ideas. Right now, we're not sure if there's something in particular that would emerge, but we think a discussion might help us focus our attention further. Thank you.
Thank you. I have Norway on the list, and then Canada and the European Union. And as we are approaching the end of the meeting, I would close it for today, but if parties would like to already say they are interested to be on the list, please let it already know, then we can know also where to start and continue the discussion. Norway, Canada, European Union. Norway.
Thank you, Co-Chair. We would like to congratulate the Secretariat for the successful workshop that allow us to reflect and exchange experience on several aspects, especially with the valuable contribution of various stakeholders sharing their expertise and experience. We believe that we can make use of those reflections and explore concrete actions that could be implemented in order to strengthening the institutional processes and institutions. Particularly, we feel that there might be further opportunities for actions to prevent illegal trade, as well as assisting countries to strengthen their licensing and quota systems. There are also other matters, such as the need to strengthen atmospheric monitoring or challenges with feedstock uses, that we think would be appropriate to address separately under the respective items already on the agenda. We support further discussion on this item. However, we are recognizant that we have already many issues that we are supposed to discuss this week. So we are positive for the co-chairs to allow some time for some discussion on this matter, but also maybe we could focus more at a MOP on this matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Norway. Then Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. This delegation would like to thank the Secretariat for the organization of Sunday's workshop on the effective implementation and enforcement of the Montreal Protocol, and also like to extend our appreciation to the panelists, facilitators, and rapporteurs for a rich and diverse discussion on parties' experience in implementing and enforcing the protocol. In light of the outcomes, together with the information collected and prepared by the Secretariat, and also recalling that parties considered the need to strengthen monitoring and reporting under the protocol in the context of discussions on the significant unexpected emissions of CFC-11 identified through atmospheric observation in 2018, we would support further discussion on specific targeted actions that could improve institutional processes to enhance monitoring, reporting, and enforcement under the protocol based on existing obligations. Specific actions could include measures that would be undertaken by individual parties, the Ozone Secretariat, or other relevant Montreal Protocol bodies, and we heard many of those examples shared on Sunday. We also heard panelists and parties mention a number of actions, including enhancing voluntary reporting from parties that discover incidences of illegal production, sharing best practices to help deter, detect, and disrupt illegal trade. And I echo the views shared by Norway and the US on focusing on those specific actions that can lead to short-term concrete actions, and also take into consideration the agenda we have and some of the broader policy issues that were discussed at the workshop that should and could be addressed under other agenda items at this meeting. So in that regard, we are the view that the scope of the discussions under this present agenda item should be limited to strengthening the institutional process through administrative or institutional actions that are pragmatic, achievable in the near term, and do not fundamentally aim at changing the Montreal Protocol, which all parties agree is working well. Thank you.
Thank you. As I just asked, are there any parties that would like to have the floor on this issue? And the reason behind it is that we can see if there are how many parties are interested to take the floor, or that we conclude it now, today, this agenda item, or that we come back to that agenda item tomorrow. So just a request, if you would like to take the floor, please do so, then we can see how we, either we conclude it now or we go further tomorrow morning. European Union.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. The European Union would like to join the other parties in thanking the Secretariat for the organization of this excellent workshop. It was very dense and based on an equally excellent or a set of excellent information notes prepared by the Secretariat. Those notes touched upon a broad range of issues, and we already expressed on some points our interest in deepen discussion and give follow-up to them. Amongst those are emissions of controlled substances from feedstock uses, but also emissions of other substances of concern, banks of controlled substances, or atmospheric monitoring. Those issues should be discussed under the specific agenda points dedicated to those items and should be continued also in future meetings. Concerning a concrete follow-up on the workshop and previous discussions, because we started the discussions already back in 2019, the EU is interested in engaging with other parties in view of developing a CRP that could lead to a limited in scope but meaningful decision at the meeting of the party this year. What elements would we like to see in it? And here we share a bit the opinion of the colleagues from the US that illegal trade and other illegal activities should be a point of focus. The definition of illegal should set a bit the scene what we are discussing, which should also include the breaches of domestic rules implemented to fulfill the obligation of the protocol. That is a reflection of the sovereignty of parties to decide by which means they wish to pursue compliance. The improvement of monitoring of illegal trade is a very important issue, and also enabling to discover and identify the real extent to which illegal activities are taking place. That can be done on the one hand by improving national systems for monitoring imports and exports, and by in this emphasizing the importance of good cooperation between the different actors in the countries. But also the broadening of global atmospheric measurements of emissions is an aspect which should be considered. Not necessarily atmospheric measurements, but also ground measurements. We have in the past had some reports on transboundary trade. Those could be revisited to update and to make use of the recommendations given in there. Of course, the exchange of information on best practices to prevent illegal activities, and that should be the top priority to prevent those incidents, but also how to sanction and follow them up. Another topic to be addressed is certainly reporting within the scope of Article 7 of the Montreal Protocol, and to explore options on how those could be enhanced, or which additional information could be provided to the protocol and the parties to share information. Domestic licensing and quota and reporting systems, here it would be useful to identify essential elements to help parties which are in the process of developing those measures for the implementation of the Kigali Amendment. Concerning compliance, at the very beginning of the discussion, back in 2019, the role of the implementation committee was addressed. And here it would be useful to have some reflections whether it would be possible to give the implementation committee a role beyond its tasks defined in Article 8, which is very much limited to verifying data reported under Article 7. It may be useful to task the implementation committee with some advisory functions, providing guidance on specific questions formulated by the parties, with support the Secretariat, which would assist the implementation committee to fulfill its role, which could then report and provide guidance and recommendations to the parties. As last point, we considered and recalled that the parties discussed back in the early 2000s the mechanisms how the inclusion of new substances could be facilitated, not necessarily requiring amendment to the protocol. Here, the Secretariat could be asked to revisit what the state of the discussion and the backgrounds of those discussions were in the past. With that, I would express our interest in engaging in a structured discussion with other parties to develop, and that we would prepare to contribute to this task, to prepare CRP to be further discussed then at this meeting as far as time allows, and then at the meeting of the parties. Thank you.
Thank you. As I indicated before, there are several countries or parties who would like to take the floor, but we would like to continue that tomorrow, because now then we can start with the terms, the contact group on the terms of reference. So I have several parties here on my list that at least tomorrow would like to take the floor for that's the Tanzania, Maldives, and Chile, and Senegal. So we don't want to rush it now. We have a contact group on the terms of reference for the next quadrennial taking place, and we will finalize this then tomorrow. So I would like to say, have a good contact group, and then later for the see you later at the reception. There will be announcements of the Secretariat.